Hi everyone, this is Nora. Today we are going to talk about the philosophy of perception. We have probably all heard of these concepts, perception. The philosophy of perception is concerned with the nature of perceptual experience and the status of conceptual data, especially their relation to beliefs or knowledge about the world. And there are many different arguments broader in this field. Examples include constructivism, inactivism, ethic. Now this is the first questions. One, what is constructivism?
Yeah, so my understanding of constructivism is basically that it views perception as a process of like previous information and then also like visual stimulus, like constructing that visual experience. So I think that it's kind of almost like psychologically speaking, it kind of seems like it's partly a top-down process. Because it's taking, that previous information that you constructed and using that to further your understanding or like gain that representation of the visual information.
No,
So second question. Oh, okay.
Sorry, no, I was just saying, I think that's like perfect. Like,
okay.
That's pretty good description.
So, second question, what is inactivism?
So this is like, I'm still kind of working through it a little bit, but this is like Noah's core claim, right? Like that not only is it like it's not only a visual experience, it's more of like a body or an organism in itself. It's like sensory motor knowledge, so it can kind of change how they perceive based on what type of information they know about the stimulus that they're looking at, which there's obviously some like bad things that I think are not brought up completely by Noah, but I think that's the core claim. It's just that there's something that relies more heavily on like the body rather than just sight.
With like the core claim, like I definitely see what like you're saying is right, but the one thing that I got where I was a little bit like I don't know about that was like it says like it's not only like depends on it, but it's like constituted by sensory motor knowledge, and I just feel like that's too like it's just too much of sensory motor knowledge, and it's not like talking about anything else either. And that's just like one thing that I was like I don't know about that.
Yeah, because I know that with the inactivism, the core claim of inactivism, they say that perception is like partly constituted on sensory motor knowledge, but then I know that Noah also recognizes that the brain is a part of that minimal supervening space for perception in his inactive approach.
Yeah, it's like I know we talked about it in the last podcast, but like just saying that only like certain types of organisms could be perceivers, I think is like, you kind of, well, I mean, you have to make a better argument if you're like, oh yeah, all these different things are perceivers, but it's still like we talked about, it's kind of like an anthropocentric argument, and it's kind of closing the door for things that like ways that animals could perceive that we don't understand completely, I guess, if that makes any sense, which I mean, I guess it makes sense because then he's not opening the door for like all this like really wild stuff, like somebody saying like, oh, a sea cucumber can also perceive, which is probably unlikely but possible in some way, that sort of thing.
No, I completely agree. I do think that his theory is a little bit too chauvinistic as well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the third question. So, what is Noah's argument for inactivism? These questions contains two parts. So please explain the experiential blindness and the input-output picture specifically.
Okay, yeah, so I know that his the first premise for his argument is basically him just saying that if the input-output model of perception is true, then experiential blindness is false. And so the input-output model of perception is basically just that there's like visual input that we take in, and then we have, the behavioral output that goes out with thought as a mediating process between those two things. And so if that model of perception is true, then experiential blindness is impossible. And experiential blindness is basically just when we have all the sensory information available to us, and we have all the mechanisms to get to that information, but we're still blind to that stimulus.
Do you know like what an example of experiential blindness would be?
So I think that a really good example is actually that, have you guys seen that? I know that Noah talks about it in the second chapter, but that video of the basketball game and the guy.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good, because people are so focused on the passing of the ball that they don't notice the gorilla at all. And even though that sensory input is there right in front of them and they can access that, they're still blind to it. So I think that that's like a really good example.
Okay. I don't know. I'm more like I need to know more about what Noe thinks rather than just like the kind of sections that we have, because it's like, at least in that example with the the basketball game, it's almost like, rather than, I guess, like not movement but like sensory motor knowledge, it's more of like, it's because of our attention. And now we like have to bring up an argument about like, what is attention, what is it doing, like how does it work with our perception. But I think that is a lot more, like attention is something that's a lot more I can get behind, if that makes sense. Like if Noah like took the argument or was like, oh, that's because you're actually like the focal or the foci of attention is blah 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 blah, and then like laid out this other argument about how like attention actually really sucks or whatever, I think like I would be like, yeah, that's awesome, rather than like, oh no, you need to like be able to move and understand how this like stimuli moves in order to like perceive it. And I don't know, it's kind of like I'm so conflicted. And it's just weird, like it's kind of a weird argument to make a little bit.
Yeah, no, I see that too. I wish that, we were able to read more about Noah and to get his opinion on that specifically.
Yeah.
I agree to it, because like what we're shown, like what his argument is, I also get confused on that, but then I get it more with the example of the basketball and the gorilla. But also it is like, what I understand from it is that you have to pay attention to it, but if you pay attention to one thing, you don't see the other.
Yeah, it definitely seems like with the gorilla video example that it's more of an intention issue than like a sensory motor knowledge issue.
Yeah. So it seems more that you need to pay attention to everything, but you still don't see every little detail that's going on. It's not so much of sensory emotion, but it's more of attention.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because like if they hadn't prompted us at the beginning to like of the video to like watch like these people with like their color shirts like throw the ball, then you would have just seen everything probably a bit more. So it was more like what you're supposed to be doing instead of the sensory motor knowledge.
Yeah, and then I also think just like the rest of his argument as well for inactivism isn't really strong, because he kind of relies on like experiential blindness being a thing to provide evidence for his argument, but it still doesn't necessarily prove that inactivism is true, So I think his whole argument in general is just like kind of weak.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Like, just because experiential blindness exists does not mean like 100% logically that, oh, therefore it's an activism. It could be like a whole range of things that he just like doesn't care about. Yeah, I didn't think that was too much of an issue, honestly, because it just flew under my radar. But yeah, that's actually a really good point. Is like he's saying that there's a difference between like causation and correlation, but then also using it in his own argument to be like, oh, just because this doesn't work, therefore we should take an activism.
Yeah.
I think too that most of my like qualms with this argument are just I don't know, like it could be better and more expansive, like if that makes sense. Like it could just be or not that it's not well articulated, but I feel like at least from my knowledge of it, there are some areas that could be really, really expanded upon. And obviously that's because we only read like 2 chapters
Yeah.
of the book. But it's kind of like we were saying earlier, where you can, or I was saying in class actually, that like constructivism and enactivism don't have to be against each other. I think that they can be like, if you add another premise to the argument and just say like sometimes perception works in different ways, you can kind of get around that, and they're not like completely inherently against each other as arguments. And I think that would be like, that'd be interesting, because there are times when we have to perceive things with our other senses rather than just sight. Like, I don't know, like a spicy meal, like somebody that could be like, yeah, this chicken was super spicy, and then it's not really that spicy, right? And then you wouldn't perceive that object really in its entirety unless you tasted it or did something besides sight. But then also, obviously, there are very specific instances in where you need to see something in order to experience it. Like, I don't know, like a traffic light, right? Like your day-to-day life, you need to be able to see that. And that's how you kind of perceive the world and get around. It's just based on sight. So I don't know. I'm still just kind of, I don't know, on the fence. And it's weird too, because I like embodied cognition so much, which is just interesting. And I don't think I like Noe's like just hardcore, like this is what it is, this is what it has to be. I think that that's what's kind of turning me off.
Yeah. Now, I see your point too about the constructivist or the constructivist approach and the enactive approach being like compatible theories. I see that too.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next one. How does enactivism contrast with traditional approach to perception?
Yeah, so I know that enactivism kind of takes the approach or like understands the perceiver as an actor, where the traditional approach understands the perceiver as a spectator. And then, another big difference is just that with the enactive approach, it's both the mind and the body are viewed to be like a constitutive part of perception. And then in the traditional approach, it's just the brain that is constituting perception.
Yeah, that's a good
Okay.
that's a good example or like explanation for sure.
Okay, next. What are the implications of enactivism?
So we kind of like hinted one of them earlier. It was like, this only makes that like some organisms with the ability to use sensory motor knowledge to be able to be perceivers, which I think kind of both opens and closes the door for like other arguments that people can make. That's one of the big ones that I'm actually like, I don't know, I'm really focused on that one. That one I think is kind of difficult for me to get over.
Yeah, it's kind of like constricting because it's like and it also doesn't explain like exactly which ones. So then it's like really like dependent. It just feels it just feels not right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like what do we define as like skilled bodily activity? Like that could take different definitions in different species, and yeah, it's confusing.
I think there are like a few other implications too. I can't remember them off the top of my head. That are also interesting and I think worthwhile to like talk about and kind of think through. But yeah, that's what counts as like a skilled actor, I guess, or like, yeah, is just so left up in the air. And it's just, yeah, where's the line drawn? Because, like animals, most of them I would consider pretty skilled at movement, right? Like, so I don't know if Noe would also accept that or not.
Yeah.
As people, we are not all the same of how we process things or are able to do things. So for everybody, the skilled body, it's not the same for all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Like even within the human species, what defines skilled bodily activity can still vary.
Yeah, because like for someone that can't see, they get around a different way from people that can. If you can't hear, then it's the same thing. So like what is it for us versus what is it for them?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Okay, next one. What is Block's challenge to inactivism?
Yeah, so I know that he in his or in the reading that we read, I know that he brings up two major points or two major challenges, and one is the issue of causation versus constitution, and then the other is what he calls the empirical issue. So like with the first one, the issue of causation and constitution, he kind of takes the example that Noe uses of the kittens on the carousel, and how, you know, they have the same, you know, visual stimulus, but they have a different visual experience because one is passively riding the carousel while the other one is like pushing it. And so he's saying that that difference is like constituted by bodily activity. And Block basically just challenges that and says that it doesn't necessarily prove that perception is constituted by bodily activity, but only proves that bodily activity is, or perception is causally dependent upon bodily activity.
Yeah, that was kind of hinting what I was like talking about earlier, because I like agree with Block's like formulation of it is like it proves that it's like causally dependent on, but you don't have to make that next step and say that it's required in every case, which I think would like, I don't know. It also makes sense, like when you think about it, like academically, you know, if you come out with like this really like weird argument that everybody's like, I'm not sure about that. Like it gets talked about and circulated more. So it's like kind of smart in that respect, where it's like, oh, I'm going to do something really crazy so that people talk about it.
Yeah.
So that could be like honestly the reason why he's just like jumping for like this much like specificity and like this like chauvinistic idea.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I totally agree with Block though. It is like a huge jump to go to that conclusion. Yeah, and then the second challenge, the empirical issue, I know that he basically just says that it's like the the fact that Noe claims that guided action is also constituted by sensory motor knowledge, I think is what Block has like a specific issue with. And I know that he brings up like the research we've done and what we know about the dorsal and the ventral visual system. So like, for example, the Ebbinghaus illusion with the two, you know, circles, one looks bigger than the other. Like visually, we consciously perceive, you know, one circle to be smaller than the other. But if we were to go to grab those two things, our grip size doesn't change between the two. And that action is guided by the dorsal visual system. So that's kind of where Block is saying that Noe's conclusion, I guess, doesn't like reflect the phenomenology of experience.
Okay. What is the snapshot conception of visual experience?
So the snapshot conception, I think it's like kind of comparing like a visual experience to a photograph. And then like specifically it says it's like in the way that it's sharply focused, detailed, and highly resoluted. And then the part where I was like, I don't know about this is that it says from the center of like your fixation, so what you're exactly staring at, to like your periphery. And I just feel like if I'm staring at something, that thing will be clear in like all the ways it is. But then like everything else like that I'm not staring at exactly isn't going to be perfectly like a photograph. I would have to look at it and change my fixation. So I feel like the only thing that's really that would be in the snapshot is just like the center of fixation. So it doesn't really work, I feel like.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like the fact that it claims that we have, you know, high resolution, like visual perception of things from the center of fixation all the way to the periphery is just like, I don't think that lines up with actual, you know, conscious experience of perception at all.
Yeah, it feels like how could you even write that? Or it just feels like it's not even applicable because
I
it's just
know.
like that's not right. So how does that work?
Like, how could someone have even reached that conclusion? I don't understand.
It's like not even that too. Like you can think about how pictures work too. And like a picture can sometimes be blurry too in its focus. Like it like depending on, I guess, like the photographer and what they're wanting to do. So it's like it's kind of like it's a bad metaphor, but it works really well too. Because like, well, if you want to like achieve the idea of like attention is really pivotal to like perception, because like the perception or your attention is the role of the photographer, right? So then you kind of have a way that perception works that's like, oh, it is a snapshot, at least in the sense that like there's one focus and then that focus can change the entire picture itself. But like you guys are right, like I don't look at like around my room and then the entirety of the room is like always an access for me. Or like you go to a coffee shop and you're like looking for your friend, and since your focus is on your friend, you have no idea what's lining the walls of the coffee shop at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. When you brought up attention again, like you said that before, and I realized like that's like seems like it's a really big thing that like everything kind of like needs, but that's not something talked about like ever with it. It's just kind of like, but I don't know. I feel like it should be maybe.
And a weird like side point off of attention, I don't remember specifically what class we discussed this in, but it was one of my classes from this semester. We were talking about attention, and psychologists don't even have like a definition for what attention is yet. Like we can't even define what it is because we just like it's such a crazy concept, I guess.
Oh my gosh, that's so weird. I don't know.
Right?
Yeah. Oh.
All right, next one. What is Noy's argument against the snapshot conception?
So I think that we kind of like touched on it a little bit in our own way, but his whole like argument against that is basically that you could fixate on the the tip of your thumb and someone could wave a brightly colored piece of paper in your periphery and you still wouldn't be able to pick up the color of that paper because you can't perceive things in high resolution at all in the periphery.
Yeah, that's like the whole argument. Or like what do we do in class? Like you look at the Marilyn Monroe pictures and you can't see all of them, which is kind of like a weird claim to make, that you can see like every single one of those photos at once. Yeah, that's the main point of it.
Yeah.
What is the new sorry, what is the new skepticism?
And so I don't think that I actually have like too great of an understanding about exactly what the new skepticism is. All I know is that like it claims that our implicit understanding of our visual experience is the snapshot conception model. So, and that's kind of where my knowledge about that runs out.
Yeah, I couldn't really get that one too much.
Yeah, that's about my knowledge. I thought that they were more so on like what we view or what we experience as seeing is not the entire picture of our perceptual field. So they're kind of like, oh, I think so. I don't know. I think I'm being confused by the new skeptics. I'm gonna be honest. All I know is that Noe does not like them.
Yeah, right. That's all I know.
I remember Professor Vance saying something like our like visual like perception or like just our visual experience will like fix things that are messed up or something in like our thing. And I don't know if that's the new skepticism, but when he said that, it almost sounded like maybe that was like what that was for.
Yeah, I think that was when we were talking about the inverting glass example, right?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe.
Okay. What is Noy's argument against the new skepticism?
Yeah, I think that his main thing is just that like he thinks the claim that the new skeptics make that like our implicit experience or conscious experience of our visual representation is that it is like a picture, and it's all in high resolution and everything. And I think his big argument against that is that that's not in the average person's understanding of their own visual experience. So they're like false in that claim.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, the new skeptics like hold that we make mistakes or we're mistaken about our conscious experiences, and then it relies on the blame that our ordinary conception of like conscious experiences endorses the snapshot conception. And then obviously it runs into the same problems that we just discussed about like the snapshot conception. It's like, oh, everything would be conscious all the time in present detail, and then it's not. So like therefore Noah is like, well, our snapshot conception is just wrong, and then therefore new skepticism is also incorrect.
Yeah, I think that was a much better explanation.
Okay, the last one. Let's talk about the embodied cognition versus the classical theory.
I think that this is mostly like the same as what we were saying earlier about inactivism versus constructivism, because like Noah is definitely, or maybe not, I don't know, definitely is too strong of a word, but there seems to be like some similarities for sure between these two ideas. So like the classical theory is like the person is the perceiver, or not just the person, but like the, I don't know, the agent of conscious experience, or like perception is like just a perceiver, and then embodied cognition is more of like they're an actor, and that's more specifically for inactivism. But I think that's also true for embodied cognition. And like embodied cognition is very cool because it allows for like the overlap that I'm kind of looking for is like the body does play a role, at least somewhat, in perception.
Yeah, I actually, could I get your guys' like opinion on something? Because I've been thinking about, because we've been discussing like a lot about what the minimal supervenient space for perception could be. And like a lot of people, there's a lot of debate about it being either like the body or the brain, but I think there's a lot of like situational context in which neither the brain or the body could be considered that constitutive base. Like in dreams or hallucinations or like trips on psychoactive drugs, like there's changes in visual experience, and that's not due in part at all to bodily activity. So we can't count that as the constitutive base in those circumstances. But then also Shapiro brings up that like you can turn your head, and just by turning your head, the images in the foreground will like interact differently with the images in the background. And so that's not constituted at all by the brain. So I feel like at most the brain and the body could be like perception could be causally dependent on the brain and the body at most, not constituted by it. So then in that case, I just like what I'm thinking right now is the minimal supervenient space of perception would be like a state of embodiment rather than specifically like a brain or a body. Like, what do you guys think about that?
I guess I don't see how it wouldn't be the brain. Like even like how I don't see how it wouldn't be that. I guess.
So like in the example of like the turning the head, you still think that the brain could be the constitutive base in that change in visual perception?
Like, can you explain that one more? Like what the example is?
Yeah, so it was from the Shapiro reading that we did. He was basically just talking about how someone can turn their head, and then just by turning their head, that bodily activity, the like images in the foreground will look like they interact differently with the images in the background. So he was like, I think that he was using that as an example of like perception that was constituted by bodily activity alone. If that makes sense.
I guess like I feel like it would be because it's just like it's where your head is, and so things are gonna look different like no matter where you look. So wouldn't it be you because you're the thing changing, not like the environment really?
Okay, so you still do think that it's constituted by the brain?
I think so. Yeah, I think maybe.
Okay, yeah. So I think that maybe we just have like a different understanding on that then.
No, I think your argument is like worthwhile to kind of explore. Like what else is there, I guess, I think is a question that's worth like asking, you know, because we don't really know at all. Like I want to just be like, oh, well, it depends on the attention, blah 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 blah, because I'm like inherently interested in that. But like you are right, there's like very specific scenarios in which like you mentioned where it's not really our brain, or maybe in order to satisfy like Portia's ideas as well, like it doesn't is immediately like upon a first approximation, it doesn't seem like it's the brain or the body. So yeah, I think that that's a pretty good question. I have no idea. I'm going to be honest. I don't even know. But I think that that's a very like worthwhile point to like talk about, and especially like with the more research that's been coming out with like psilocybin and like hallucinogens. Is like it's like the next evolution of the question. It's just be like,
Yeah.
okay, well, what about this now?
Yeah, I think it's definitely valid to think that like, or just to explore, because I think like to not assume that it's just, oh, it has to be your brain or your body. It could be other things out there that you just don't know about yet, because we don't know a lot about everything.
Right, yeah. I hate the discrepancies between like the situational context and, you know, what constitutes perception and what doesn't constitute perception. So I thought that maybe having the supervenience space be embodied cognition, or just like a state of embodiment, that might apply to like a wide variety of situations.
Yeah. And I mean, it even goes back to what Crystal was saying earlier, where like people, I guess, perceive differently. So like, I don't know, like my idea of sight might be different to yours. So what's the standard? Like, if that makes sense, like maybe that's like a little out there of me to say, like kind of a weird argument. But just like, or like how we taste is different. Like we have different taste buds that prefer different things and stuff like that. So it's like, if you want to draw the line at the body, then you have to like account for all of these like differences that are present in the body, and likewise in the brain. Like if you want to account for a difference in the brain, now you have to like, it's all about the context is what I'm trying to say. And I think that that's like something that wasn't really brought up.
Yeah, no, I completely get what you're saying. I think that Shapiro touched on it like a little bit too in his reading as well, when he was talking about how like, you know, differences and where the eyes are placed can create differences in, you know, the visual experience. And yeah.
See all of your guys' views. That's some like, because like Ashley, like yours is really interesting, but like we're not really talking in class of maybe it's not either of them. But from like what we know, like what Portia said, is that we know it's like the body and the mind. So like turning your head could be both.
Mhm.
And then, but it also is like what attention you're paying to it when you're turning your head.
Mhm.
It's like all three of you guys make a good point. So I'm like, you're all right, but there are like what ifs in all of them.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of what ifs, and there's a lot of like research that still needs to be done, I think, before we can make any like, or before we can use any strong evidence in support of anything, you know?
Yeah.
That's true. I think we're out of time, but this has been an awesome conversation, like always. So thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone for discussing today.